Hello, everyone. Andrew Petersen again from G'day Sharm El-Sheikh. And today I am joined by none other than Ian Learmonth, the CEO of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Australia's leading public finance investment vehicle. And we're going to have a bit of a chat about climate finance. Surprise, surprise. So welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to be here.
Welcome to the program.
Yeah.
First question for all of our guests. How many COPs is this for you?
You know, this is my second COP.
Right.
So Glasgow was my debut, a very different time and place in a sense. It was still, COVID ravaged away. You did a rat test upon entry every day. It was an extremely intense COP in the sense it was, I think as many, if not more people over a sort of smaller footprint. And it was a very different sort of COP. So anyway, interesting now to come to Sharm El-Sheikh, whole different geography, climate.
Vast, isn't it?
It's huge. It is absolutely huge.
And do you think just comparing the two, one was very much around the policy, whereas this one is, as it's been titled, Together for Implementation. It's very much around talking about how to implement.
Yeah, I think they are, it's interesting to contrast them. I mean, Glasgow was obviously about the big undertakings from countries and even China, India, Australia made its first undertaking to net zero by 2050. That was big. The first pavilion that Australia has ever had was, of course, in Glasgow. So I think, and there was a lot of ambition around keeping the 1.5 degree target alive. Now we've come to Egypt. I think there's not quite that same sense of new targets. I think there's much more a sense of how people have been going with implementing the targets they've already set. Australia is one of the few places that has actually identified a new and ambitious target, being the 43% by 2030. So that is something. And there are some other nations around that. But yes, I think there's much more of a conversation around implementation. How are we tracking? There's obviously huge concern as the UN Secretary General opened the COP with on the highway to climate hell. That statement, I think, is ringing in people's ears. And will for
not the least of which is the music rights attached to
that's right. Better talk to ACDC immediately or their lawyers. I think and Australia's whole approach to the COP is vastly different.
Right. So you're here as Clean Energy Finance Corporation. What are you here to bring, and what do you want to get out as an organisation from what you are hearing, seeing, and talking to people on the ground over the last couple of days?
I mean, in terms of bringing thinking and thoughts and experiences to COP, it's about, I guess, promoting the impact that a successful green bank can have. And Australia is in some ways very lucky in that regard. We've got, for 10 years, we've had a very well capitalized green bank.
Is that how old it is?
10 years this year.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you for that. And we've done now cumulatively $10 billion worth of transactions.
Okay.
Across a vast array of different things. There's renewable energy, there's ag, industry, there's transportation, electric vehicles, there's critical minerals, there's green bonds, there's hydrogen and technology investment. So it's, the CFC is a world-beating example of the success and impact that you can have with a properly structured green bank. So I'm trying to sort of sell that story to anyone who will listen, and I've been on panels to that end. So that's the sort of message I'm trying to get out there. And different countries and regions are approaching it differently. The US have got there under the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to try and do this sort of thing, but they're going to do it from a centralized position, and they're going to put capital out with existing financial services companies.
Right.
And Africa are doing the same. I had a great chat with an African representative around what they're doing. So that's the sort of thing that I and the CFC can bring to a COP like this. In terms of what we can take away as an organisation, I think it is seeing everything in context. Australia, we're kind of a long way away from, as we always kind of feel that sense of distance.
Is trying to change that.
But yes, it is. But you get so many other things in context. Be it what's happening with other First Nations out there, what's happening in, agriculture, what's happening around the methane pledge.
Yeah.
There's so much. It's almost overwhelming how much is going on at COP, and the ambition, the challenges. So I find that on one hand incredibly stimulating, and sometimes very sobering as well. Just how tough things, particularly the impact of climate change.
Yeah.
You do see that at a COP.
You do on every pavilion.
You do.
In the language of every leader, it is quite pervasive how much that is the challenge that's ahead. And yet, in one sense, the opportunity is writ large in the corridors of the very noisy pavilions that we're circulating at the moment. So, in thinking about the role of the CEFC, and you made this interesting observation about other countries doing other things, are you seeing other countries interested in the model that we've employed and not necessarily taking it up, but utilising some sort of ideas around what Australia has put in place for 10 years?
Yeah, I don't see as much of it as you would hope.
Okay.
Because there really aren't, since the UK's Green Investment Bank was sold to Macquarie, we kind of stand alone as a multi-billion-dollar independent green bank in the world today.
Okay.
There, of course, governments do this in different ways. Sometimes they do it directly off a government's balance sheet without creating the institution that is something like a CFC or a green bank. And, so there are various ways of tackling it. I think the overarching thing is the world knows that there's a huge amount of private capital, hundreds of trillions of dollars. And, we've heard from Mark Carney at COP 2026 about, that global alliance around the private sector investing in net zero. But I think what everyone realizes is private sector capital is always chasing an appropriate return.
Yeah.
Because it's got shareholders, it's got members of that pension fund, and they're not wanting to kind of trade off return for the good of the planet. It needs government and state-sponsored capital to work really in concert with these large amounts of private sector capital to make sure that they're going to come in and play the role that they need to.
Right.
So we kind of need to push governments, states, both and second-tier states, be they state governments, Scotland's of this world, and others that feel that their role is just as important as federal kind of bodies as well.
Interesting point you raised there about the number of Australian state and territory governments that are here.
Very much so.
And the discussions, the interventions, the bilaterals they're having with Wales, Scotland.
Yes.
I mean, it's just quite fascinating to see that there is that other layer, and it's not a subtext, it's actually a text that's going on, and in addition to the national conversations that go on.
It's very true.
The one thing I wanted to probe a little bit around was Mia Motley's comments at the opening statements on last Tuesday around the need for the reworking of the capital market system. And she was encouraging a reformulation of the way in which Bretton Woods worked. And she made this big call out for there to be an international conversation about that, the role of development banks, the role of the private sector capital. Are you seeing, I'm not asking for you to comment on them, but are you seeing that conversation then permeating with others that you're talking to during the last few days?
Yeah, look, I am. I've been involved in attended a few sessions around development banks and alliances of development banks, and the issuance of the ongoing and rapidly increasing issuance of green bonds, climate bonds, transition bonds. But I worry it's not happening as quickly as we need and would like. Yeah. So I think that's something. I think it probably does need a bit more thinking. I think people need to commit to investing, and a lot of banks and investment houses are doing that.
Yeah, right.
But again, they're invariably structured to give an appropriate return to investors, and as long as they're in compliance with various taxonomies.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think look, there's at the end of the day, there's two very large pools of funding that are needed. There's returnable capital, the sort that we have, and the private sector can play a big role in that regard to fund the transition. But there's also funding that's going to be needed that isn't necessarily returnable, that's required, particularly for things like mitigation adaptation, which effectively is grant funding. I mean, if you're building a seawall in the Maldives, there's not a business model necessarily. Yeah, unless, I know that people going places like that are having to pay an additional levy to potentially pay that down. So I suppose you could create something around that. But there's just also a vast amount of capital that's going to be required to address climate damage and mitigation.
Your observation around nature at this COP and investing in nature and the nexus between climate and nature. I think there's been some early forays by the CEFC into that. And it'd be interesting to hear your observation about, do you see that becoming not ubiquitous as such, because it is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation.
Yeah.
But do you see it increasing in terms of the interest of business in finance into investing in both climate and nature?
I think that's absolutely the case. It's multifaceted. I think people tend to talk there's a lot of talk around natural capital as this new asset class. And I happen to, another great thing about COP, I ended up in a working group with the Natural Capital Investment Alliance on, in fact, day one, which was exciting.
Right.
Met some very interesting people, and sort of more Eurocentric. Yep. Look, Australia has an enormous advantage in the sort of country that it is, and the incredible ability of soil carbon sequestration. Obviously, emissions from agriculture are very substantial. They're 17% or so. So, but again, ag, it's a very diverse landscape. There's investment potential in cropping, in the pastoral sector, in forestry, and that is growing and has potential, and now has, of course, its carbon offset potential in all of that. There's the technology angle to that. And we've made some investments
in tech, apparently.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're still talking ag tech, but I'm sure we'll have to upgrade that at some point. Yeah, but that could well be, the Sphaerogopsis technology, the seaweed that as a food additive to reduce methane in cattle. I've been meeting with a number of people here, around the Australian Pavilion. Some of my best networking in Australia comes from the Pavilion in the course of a year.
With the coffee.
Well, that coffee, it creates an atmosphere like no other.
It is the most brilliant lubricants at this COP.
It does seem to be. But yes, so you've got the big lumpy stuff, which is, the actual agricultural assets. Then you've got the technology required, which Australia, I think, is a leader in some respects around some of that. And that can be exported, of course, globally. And that's a different sort of capital. That's venture capital. And then the people investing in forestry and ag may well be the so-called natural capitalist investors. And, and then the whole carbon dimension to all of that. And there are, of course, Australian industries going to be looking for offsets probably more than ever. You're probably well placed to talk about that sort of thing. But the world's looking for offsets, possibly from Australia as a net exporter. And I've been meeting African countries like Gabon, who I met a fellow from there who was telling me how he was marketing 50 million tons of carbon offsets because they're in surplus.
Wow.
And he's working with some of the the carbon or climate bank private sector players to sell those offsets to German power companies, for example, or other sovereigns. Anyway, so ag and natural capital, increasing focus for the CFC, but I think increasingly important for Australia.
Yeah, okay. Final question. What's your hope for this COP?
Yeah, look, I think if I could take back a handful of new and inspiring ideas and context for what we're doing in a global sense, that would be great. I've already broadened my network both internationally and domestically. And
who knew the business started to come back?
Yeah,
I had completely forgotten that trick.
I had to go and call for a colleague who came over halfway through to bring me some more. I mean, there's a lot of QR codes being
This is
passed
true,
around.
and LinkedIn helps, but
Yeah,
just amazing.
yeah. Look, that is fascinating. But I must admit though, the other interesting thing about the Australian Pavilion and the approach I've really noticed is the increased focus on First Nations, Australia and the Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
And I think that's a strong message for me to think about our role with supporting First Australians, who of course are, I've been working with nature in Australia
for some considerable time,
a considerable amount of time, and in many cases are affected more than anyone else by climate change.
And I'm sure you share this view as well. Some beautiful storytelling about what's going on.
Tremendous.
Across the Pacific and on land, on country, that we've been hearing at our pavilion.
We have.
Which is just extraordinary. So thank you so much for your
pleasure,
time.
Andrew.
Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you at the next G'day Sharm El-Sheikh in the not too distant future. Bye for now.